for Men Radio, ladies and gentlemen, and, of course, regular listeners. This is Red Pill Radio. I'm John Yether, and this is the show reminding women and men that no means no, and nullify means not guilty. Today, we're examining whether an ideology, a set of ideas, can be so dangerous to a human mind that it inhibits or even prevents rational thought. In this case, the ideology is, of course, feminism, which is a catch-all name for a set of related dogmas, almost all of which, in one way or another, define feminine identity by victimhood. Sometimes this is sexual in nature, as in the popular mythology of rape culture. For those listeners who've been off the planet for the past several decades, that's the mythology that rape is a prevalent feature in our culture. For the hopelessly uninformed, the FBI tracks the rates of criminal victimization for various types of crime, and of all the types of criminal victimization tracked, rape and sexual assault combined comprise the lowest incidence rate of violent crime. Rape culture doesn't actually exist except as a narrative tool to extract shame and compliance from men and funding and agreement from wider society. But sexual victimization isn't where it ends by any stretch. We also have, within feminism's various flavors, a nearly universal theme of both historical as well as ongoing oppression of females by the patriarchy. Sometimes, if a strong enough local case can be made disproving it, the narrators of patriarchy theory will be temporarily swayed by evidence that this supposed omnipresent female oppressing patriarchy is a myth. And these narrators will hedge their argument and sometimes change their preferred language to use the word kyriarchy or keriarchy. This doesn't usually last long because kyriarchy doesn't produce a clearly demarked enemy class the way patriarchy does. Men, of course, being that universal enemy. But however you slice it and however you sell it, feminism depends on a self-identity for its female proponents as a victim class. This is not the logical recognition of victimhood in a specific instance such as being a victim of a hit-and-run car accident or an assault or any real-world event based on situation, which has a limited time reference based on some violent event. We're talking about fundamental, lifelong self-identity as a victim, tying that victimhood to sexual biology. To be female is to be a victim. At least within the ideology of feminism, that is the case. And for those of you who might be liberal feminists or sex-positive feminists or egalitarian feminists, furiously calling into the show or typing on your keyboards to tell me that I've got it all wrong and that this victim identity politic is just radical feminism and that your flavor of the brand is different, I'll say this. If somewhere in your philosophy there is not an element of women are victimized by the system or by men or victimized by the patriarchy or by the necessities of female biology, if you don't have that, then you are not really a feminist. But this self-identity as a victim has some real-world consequences on an individual's ability to think rationally. Once a person self-identifies as a victim based on a component of their identity, then afterwards all social transactions and all politics are filtered through a lens of victimhood. It ceases to matter what other people's intentions or views actually are, whether they are malign or amicable or neutral. The lens of victim identity colors everything. Everything in life comes to represent victimization or oppression or deliberate damage. This cognitive lens superimposes malice onto any expression or action which doesn't confirm and reinforce the victim bias. This is why, in feminist-driven discourse, opposition or even criticism of feminism is labeled as hatred of women. Misogyny is the preferred term. Noting, as is still apparently necessary, that misogyny is, by definition, the hatred of women. and that women and feminism are two separate things, one being a group of people and the other being an ideology. They are easy to tell apart, and not just because one is a group of people and the other is an idea, but also because they're spelled differently. That's why we have separate words. However, the fact that this keeps needing to be pointed out requires an explanation. In a world where most adults are capable of rational thought, how can this continued conflation, this continued confusion of women, which are people, and feminism, which is ideology, how can rational adults keep confusing these two things and not be called out publicly on the fallacy except by people like me? One argument is that this continued confusion between a biological demographic and a violent philosophy indicates the public is deeply stupid, that most people are just dumber than rocks. George Carlin famously pointed out that the average IQ is 100, and that half the people alive at any given point are even dumber than that. However, the apparent confusion between an ideology, which is insubstantial as a construct of thought, and a population identifiable by its sexual characteristics, is so huge, it is such a monumental error that sheer stupidity is not sufficient to explain it. An alternative hypothesis might be that the continued claim that criticism or even opposition to a violent ideology is the same thing as hatred of a group of people based on their sex, that this apparent confusion is actually just deception, that the proponents of this repeated confusion are actually all just liars. I think some of them are liars, but the vast majority of those who swallow and then further propagate this claim without objection, I will suggest that these people are not engaging in a deliberate falsehood. They are mentally impaired by an intellectual poison which inhibits rational thought and prevents logic. In this cognitive fog, there is a created reality in which human beings are divided into warring factions. All social commerce is colored by this mental poison, because in this narrative, every human contact requires identification of victim and predator, and thus a negotiation of who, by conforming to this narrative, is one of the good guys, and who, by either overt rejection or by ignorance of the victim component of female identity, who is one of the bad guys. Victim identity for an entire biological demographic creates a state of permanent war. But this is only half the conversation. What about male feminists? How does our culture's mainstream narrative of a vague, an invisible, but somehow an ongoing victimization of all women, how does this affect male identity, and in particular, conformist male identity in the wider blue Kool-Aid drinking public? We will be returning in just a few minutes to address that, and we will be taking calls afterwards at 310-388-9709. Okay, we are back. We're back on A Voice for Men Radio. I'm John the Other. And we're talking about feminism's mainstream narrative of victimhood and what that means for men in our culture. Stating right up front that unless men identify themselves as specifically non-feminist, that most men in a feminist-dominated culture are, if they conform to social norms, by default, masculine feminists. If you're a man in this culture and a conformist, you have bought into the story that due to your sex, you're a member of a class of oppressors, predators, and potentially rapists. Now, a lot of regular guys listening are going to say, wait a minute, I know that I'm none of those things. I'm not violent. I have no desire to rape anybody or to oppress anybody. I'm a good guy as opposed to a bad guy. So what is this distinction? I will suggest to you that this distinction has very little to do with any kind of ethical conduct or viewpoint, and it has everything to do with conformity. If you're a good guy, you're on the side against what we define as a bad guy. That is, an exploiter, a misogynist, and taken further, a male adhering to male nature as it is defined by the ideology, defining feminine identity as something intrinsically linked to victimhood. The radical feminist Pam O'Shaughnessy, writing under the pen name Vliet Tiptree, laid it out by saying, our sharp, clear boundary definition of oppression that begins and ends with women. In her ideology, oppression and feminine identity are the same thing. The mythology of the good man and the bad man in this narrative is a way of forcing men to agree that they are innately corrupt or evil, but by conformance to this narrative, they are one of the, quote, good guys. Wrapped up in this thinking is the surrender of logic and rationality, and I'll argue damage to the brain's ability to use logic and reason. For the overtly feminist man, that is, not the regular guy who is just a regular guy immersed in the culturally normative feminist narrative that we are all socialized into before we take the red pill. But I'm talking about the self-identifying male feminist. This is a creature of nearly unparalleled moral depravity. Once we recognize the victim identity of feminist thought as associated to feminine existence and identity, then it becomes obvious that male feminism requires an internal denial of the validity of masculine self-identity. For overt male feminists, there is a persistent thread of guilt, or if you prefer, religious terminology, a thread of sin attached to male identity. And that male feminism requires ongoing and permanent alienation of self-identity as a man to be one of the good men, apart from those other bad men. You know, the ones who are, by definition, evil, predatory, rape-centric, and so on. This means that male feminists must be one of two things. The first possibility is a level of irrationality and denial of reality that if it were conforming to any ideology besides what is already accepted as politically palatable, we would read this as psychosis. The second possibility being that a persistent conformance with this idea of innate male evil or accepting a reality of socially normal male supremacy while being male, except with the caveat that, you're one of the good ones, demands a level of dishonest opportunism which is totally incompatible with anything that we can call ethical behavior. I think there's a little bit of column A here and a little bit of column B. And I believe most women naturally recognize that the dangerous carrion-eater mentality of a male feminist, that an overtly supine male feminist ethic demonstrates predatory nature. This is why the most pronounced and sycophantic male feminists, such as the male members of the Conscious Man Project, are so naturally repulsive to women. The third potential outcome of male conformance to the socially approved narrative of perpetual female victimhood and its sometimes implied indictment of masculine nature as innately predatory, and in other cases, the explicit accusation, is that men who grow up in a culture which constantly drums into them the story that due to their masculine identity that they are naturally evil or naturally violent or naturally corrupt. They buy into this, and they fulfill these expectations by becoming what they live their lives accused of. That, in my view, is the worst of all possible outcomes, because once we are there, once that is the normal in our society, how do we have anything except a society permanently tiered along sexual lines, where this perverse ideology of hatred and at one remove violence is used to devalue the humanity of half the human race based on sex? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know the way out. We're going to take one more break, and we're going to come back with callers. The number to call is 310-388-9709. Okay, all right, we're back. I'm just going to talk for a second here because I'm not sure if the mic is live. Oh, good, it is. Okay, we got one caller on the line. I'm just going to give out the number again. If you want to call in, the show is 310-388-9709, and we've got Open War on the line here. And Open War, what have you got to say?
Hey, John, how you doing? I've been a long-time listener.
Excellent, sir.
Fan of the show. No,
Thanks very much for calling.
Yeah. I actually called in because I do have a career working with what might be called the cognitively disabled, and I think it would actually be doing the feminists too great a compliment to call them cognitively disabled. You know, we're almost giving them an excuse.
Well, perhaps there's treatment for them, you know.
Yeah, you know, certain pill we really like to take around here.
The red one, that's right, take the red pill. So what can you tell us about what you're working with, what kind of people you're working with without giving too much away?
Just the kind of people who are actually born that way rather than indoctrinated systematically to wage war on men. And, I mean, that's really what feminism is about. It's about making good, loyal foot soldiers.
Well, yeah, I have been convinced for a long time that feminism is not a self-contained movement. It is, in fact, a tool being used to manipulate a large group of people and set them against another large group of people. Those two groups happen to be men and women. The objectives are to fragment the familial bonds between people and to make people less cooperative and more hateful towards each other, and to basically divide and conquer society and make society more pliable to a top-down control. I don't think it is any coincidence at all, even slightly, that we're witnessing the erosion of civil rights, the eradication of what are in the United States protected in the Bill of Rights, at the same time as the rise and the normalization of this ideology, which wraps itself in humanism, but essentially is nothing but a mask for proxy violence and hatred against a biological demographic. And I think the thing is metastasizing into, also it's becoming hateful towards women, although that is probably not evident to a lot of people yet. But I mean, when you look at the definition of what is or what is not a rape, based on a woman has a drink or she gets drunk and now loses the ability to consent to having a sexual relationship, this doesn't make sense if you think that men and women are equal. It only makes sense if you think women are some sort of children.
Yeah, well, and it's basically robbing them of accountability. I mean, at some point, and they're putting us in place. You know, we're going to take the punishment for them in that instance. Yeah, I mean, you're gonna use as the beating as the scapegoat men who may or may not be party to whatever a woman does, but with the removal of accountability, you're removing adult volition. And in this cognitive failure, in the inability to tell the difference between what is going on, you get a demographic of human beings who are essentially highly pliable children without higher cognitive function. I don't think this does any favor at all to women. I certainly don't think it's to their benefit. It's not to the benefit of society. The only people I can imagine who are going to benefit from this are the people who move the debt, the financial debt from corporations onto the public and international bankers, perhaps the top-tier politicians. Other than that, not very many people. Well, you know, John, I almost don't want to give them that way out. Because a lot of these people, I mean, having been in the academy a long time, I can tell there are plenty of intelligent people who are capable of reasoning, and there's almost a selective block that they engage in. They literally press the reset button where they will not reason past a certain point, especially when you talk about, so FGM is so terrible in Africa, for example, but then why are we circumcising the majority of American males? That's ridiculous. And it's disconnects that they engage pretty regularly.
It's like you have the ability to reason in look at a pie chart of all the areas of your life. If you put them in a pie chart, your work life and your private life and your sexual life and your sports, recreational life, all the different things you do,
and you put that in a pie chart. And then you label a couple of those slices of the pie, you paint them black or something, and things that fall within those areas are entirely doctrinally controlled, that you just conform to whatever is the prevalent narrative. In the other areas of your life, you employ the ability to reason and to make logical decisions and to evaluate things based on evidence. But in the areas that are painted black, no, there's no employment of your cognitive functions. Now, I encountered this before I started to become really active as an MRA. A lot of people probably know that I'm an atheist. Now, that doesn't mean that I am trying to take anybody's religion away from them, and whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or whatever it is you are, I don't begrudge anybody their belief system. But when you are arguing on certain topics with the fundamentally religious, the people who are, I would say, the most hardcore literalists in interpreting whatever it is their religious doctrine is. You know, like the people who read the Bible and go, well, the earth is 6,000 years old because we added together all the people and their lifetimes, and that's what we got. There seems to be a kind of cognitive malfunction in certain people, and I'm certain I've offended people in the last 2.5 minutes, and I apologize for that. But from the point of view of a rationalist view of reality, where you make decisions based on evidence, and yet you have these people reading out of this one book, and they go, this book is the truth, everything else gets pushed to the side and won't even be considered. I think we're seeing the same kind of cognitive malfunction as we do when we're dealing with the feminists when it comes to the victimhood mentality.
Well, these people are almost certainly created. I mean, it's not like people are born inherently more likely to be a feminist. They have to be molded. And it's a process of institutional shaping. You take a kid who has no experience of what truth is or right or wrong, and you pat him on the back whenever he talks about female victimization, and you give him an F whenever he talks about the marginalization of men in the family, for instance. And after enough repetitions of this kind of conditioning, you have a Pavlov's dog effect, where you take a perfectly reasonable person and put these blocks in their logic, where if they were to transgress those limitations, they're immediately thinking of the switch. You know, they're thinking of that electric shock that was continuously applied whenever they said certain things or did certain things. And it's just a process of shaping people to act like those good little foot soldiers, you know?
Yeah, that does occur to me too, although it doesn't exactly explain people like you and me and Paul Elam, because I was certainly shaped by my culture. My mother was a hardcore feminist. My father was not particularly innovative in his thinking, so I didn't come to my rather contrarian viewpoint by following anybody else's path. Is it possible that in order to be a reasonable and logical person, you have to be the bad kid who just goes against whatever he's told?
Well, yeah, and that's totally true. I mean, some of the greatest philosophers in history, they were outliers. They weren't the bell curve, so to speak. They were at the outside edges. And I'd say that we are pretty much predestined as MRAs to be on the outside of that distribution. We're never going to be the mainstream for just that reason, because we defied the switch, we defied the electric shock, and we defied the pat on the back. And we're trying to look for long-term good outcomes rather than the immediate approval of the elites.
So let me ask you a question. How do you reach the, I don't know, what are they, authoritarians, conformists, the people who obeyed the negative reinforcement? How do you get through to them? Is it possible? Or does the whole system have to come crashing down and we start from scratch? Because I see that coming, but I think it's a terrible outcome. I certainly don't want to create that disastrous situation.
Well, I hope we never do get there. I've been very inspired by your work and the work of Paul Elam. I think you guys are giving them the boot in the ass that they're going to need to realize that their ideology doesn't speak for everyone. It doesn't have all the answers, and in fact, we do dare to take an alternative viewpoint, and unapologetically at that.
Now, one of the things that I was reading today, I wrote my show opening during the day today, and then I had a chance to do a little bit more reading. There was an article that I read that was talking about cognitive mapping this was a research done in Germany looking at multi-generational cognitive mapping and levels of stimulation necessary to register as a process on the human mind. And what this research indicated was that as we have progressed as a society that is more and more inundated by stimulus, particularly in terms of media and advertising, that our threshold for what we are capable of noticing is going down, and we are only being able to register the most extreme of stimulus. Now, this has some sort of rather unsettling implications. One is that if you raise a generation of children on cartoons that hyperstimulate them, they can be manipulated into really quite egregious behavior that is below their threshold of notice by an authoritarian social system, such as getting a generation of kids for whom it is perfectly acceptable and below their threshold of notice for them themselves to be enacting violence against other people as, say, enforcers working for the state or social workers, papering over really what we now would regard as egregious violations of human rights. I think James probably wants to say something here as well.
Oh yeah. I was just
okay.
I was just taking a look at how the mapping process inside the brain works. I'd like to get Dr. T on, if at all possible, to explain a little bit about what she knows about it. I'm sure her wealth of knowledge is much greater than ours.
Yeah, I was talking to Paul earlier today about this, and in fact, a friend of mine from YouTube also was quite interested in the cognitive, like the overstimulation of input creates sort of an almost blandness that in children you don't see registration of extremely violent acts unless there is sort of a plot, a conflict, stuff yet to be resolved. That if there's no dichotomy of outcome, you're going to see children completely bored by what you and I as adults would regard as really outrageously violent and horrifying stuff, because it's above our threshold of notice but below theirs. They've been brought up in a much more stimulated environment. Now, as you get older, obviously
the desensitization process is what it is, and believe it or not, I think feminism is doing the same thing. It's literally desensitizing portions of the population to basic morality.
Now, the other factor, which I haven't talked about in this discussion yet, but that I've talked about a little bit in some article content on A Voice for Men, is that in a society that is hierarchical, as ours is, we have a social and an economic elite in our society, particularly the bankers and the people funding political campaigns, people like Ben Bernanke and the various unseen actors that operate in the central banks behind such public employees as Bernanke and Obama and Eric Holder. But what we see, this really quite blatant corruption, quite blatant malicious behavior, the transference, for example, of the bad debts of irresponsible bankers from those bankers onto the public. And this being treated as if it's a normal thing. It was, well, yeah, the bankers took bad risks and ruined the housing market, and they won't go to jail, but a person who smokes pot goes to jail. It's this really kind of grotesque difference between real consequences and these broken, fabricated consequences. And I've just got Paul calling me. I'm not sure how he thinks I can answer him. I'm on the air. So in a society where you have this grotesque kind of corruption at the top tier of the society, you're going to quite quickly get a public who can't tell the difference between right and wrong. And this, I think, feeds into the narrative of feminism, where you follow this viewpoint. You're told that men are bad, women are good, no matter what. The objective reality that you're looking at doesn't seem to inform your value judgments, and the dichotomy between your ethical compass, which is internal, and this externally imposed conditioning that the people at the top tier of your society are wildly unethical, dishonest, and dysfunctional, creates a population who can't tell the difference between right and wrong and have to be told by the narrative. And how do we get into this? I don't know. But perhaps the answer is that the whole thing comes crashing down and we start over. But, geez, I sure hope I'm wrong there, because that sounds like a terrible idea to me.
Well, that's one way we could do it. Or we could make that long-term terrible consequence more immediate for people. You know, the kind of protests you guys have planned, I think, was that over in Kentucky or somewhere else? There's like Nashville. Yeah, Nashville, artistry against misandry, those kind of folks, and really just making a publicly aware movement that discusses these kind of issues and the potential pitfalls for human society here in the United States and the rest of Western society. I think we need to very fun. Yeah.
A lot of what is talked about within the men's movement, like such as the marriage strike and men going their own way, this has some negative consequences for the compliant blue pill public. Like, if large numbers of men opt out of the treadmill of being protector, provider, disposable utility, you're going to get corporations failing, you're going to get governments failing, it'll sack national economies. And that is really a byproduct, not a direct goal of this activism. The going your own way is to allow men to have a life that they actually can live a life as human beings, not as somebody else's disposable utility. The fact that it creates this byproduct, this spin-off effect of defunding a corrupt system is, I don't know, do I say that we're doing damage for its own sake, or is the damage a consequence of the system itself can't run without the damage done to human beings?
I just say we're giving them they're reaping what they sowed, which was an entire generation of disaffected males who have nothing vested in this system and its maintenance. And to the extent that they keep this system running, they're going to keep having the same problem. The more apparent we can make that to the powers that be, the better.
Yeah, I'm of two minds of that. I don't like seeing the social carnage. I mean, I know it's a byproduct, and I know that by opting out, I'm adding to it. But at the same time, I'm not willing to sit here and be a utility for somebody. I'm not prepared to live my life as a resource. I'd much rather be a human being, even if it's one that receives public censure. They point at me and they go, "There's the bad man." Everybody else, come on, you want to be the good man, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing is, and Girl Rights What was talking about this a couple of days ago in a YouTube video, talking about the issue of sort of small p patriarchy. Because a few people have come on and accused her of being a supporter of the capital P patriarchy, which I find totally ludicrous. She is about as much a supporter of that as I am of the communist system of government. But she was talking about returning to men some of their human rights, some recognition of men as, being allowed to have due process of law when they're accused, which they no longer are, or being treated as viable members of the family, which they really no longer are. And using sort of a more of a push to return men's rights to them to get the society back onto its wheels and maybe put in arrest some of this economic slide. As much as I would like to see men have their human rights, I think in putting the culture back on its economic wheels, that probably has longer-term negative consequences, particularly that the economies of Western nations now are increasingly set up to fail on a semi-regular basis. We're looking at economic crises occurring between 15 and 24 months apart on a pretty routine basis now. And with each one of these economic crises, I guess is the correct word, we look at a restructuring where artificially jobs are created and handed to essentially to the service economies, which are dominated by women. We're looking at the education system increasingly enabling women through affirmative action and increased access to grants, female favoring access to the programs. In the UK, there is the Labour government now has a female-only core of the Labour government. They've actually excluded men from government, which the fact that that hasn't sent shockwaves and alarm bells through UK society indicates just how far into cuckoo land we've gone. But what's going to happen with this increasing system of repeated semi-economic collapse and restructuring is that you're going to have an increasingly tiered society along economic sexual lines, where men are increasingly disenfranchised, unable to access education, unable to access meaningful employment or meaningful career paths, women getting higher education by preference and occupying sort of the protected job status. That only has one possible outcome in my mind, and that is eventually a social convulsion which is very violent. So how do you stop that social convulsion?
Is drawing our lines in the sand, John. I mean, if you look at cultures that are very repressive towards one gender or the other, they don't set these standards ahead of time. If women fail to draw their line in the sand, you get Saudi Arabia and that kind of controlling society on women. If men don't draw their line in the sand, we get the Western matriarchy. And so it's really up to
The problem is that you're starting out from a highly industrialized technological culture.
True.
And I think a number of people have already seen the inception of military technology being increasingly adopted by civilian police forces, such as they're using the drone technology that they've been using to assassinate people in Pakistan and Iran. They're now deploying that in police forces in the United States. So because the real work of police, in spite of all of our technological advances, still requires men to put their asses on the line, strap on body armor and guns, and go out and actually deal violence, which has a moral cost. It has a direct cost to those men. Police are essentially on the line of fire. But if the sexual demographic being used to maintain a rigid control on society, that is, the men, the police forces, if those are the very same men being increasingly disenfranchised economically and educationally, at some point, the men holding the guns are the ones reacting violently, which is why I think we're seeing an increasing use of drone technology. We're going to see these drones used not by the police against the civilian population, although I think we'll see that as well, but at some point you're going to see these drones used against the police because they're the ones with the guns. And if you have a male police force who wake up and recognize that they have been left out in the cold while the society has moved to one type of citizens who have jobs, access to education, money, housing, real food, and another class of societies based on sex who don't have access to education, don't have any real job options, how do you stop the convulsion except by the remote control use of force? I don't think you're ever going to see a female police force standing and trying to restore order in a city that is having food riots.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have every right to be concerned about this because it's our tax dollars funding the downfall of our own society. It's kind of like the snake eating its own tail. And to the extent that men don't wake up, we're going to have more and more willing bodies for funerals.
Yeah. I noticed that James is back on
to this.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I really don't see an easy way out with all this. I think at some point in time we are going to look at another financial depression, especially if we keep on with the entitlements that we are currently just handing out to everyone. However, I think part of the job is to actually soften the hammer blow. And this is one of the reasons why whatever publicity we can possibly get out there is good publicity. If we can soften this hammer blow, then it'll make the rebuilding effort a little bit easier, and anyone who wants to stand up and try to do the same thing again, rebuilding society in the same way, will end up getting smacked down for it.
Oh, that's actually great. In one of the articles, I left a comment arguing with some idiot leftist, and I actually quoted Marx at him, and I said that we are easing the birth pangs of the new society, in the sense that when the cataclysm does happen, we can pretty much modulate the magnitude with which everything falls apart.
Yeah,
I think
don't
that's
know.
part of what we want to do.
I'm just going to give out the number to call into the show again in case anybody wants to call. It's 310-388-9709. Dr. T, if you're listening, we'd like to hear from you on this cognitive failure that we're talking about. And I understand Paul's been trying to call. He's trying to call me on my Skype, but I can't answer him because I'm doing the show. So I'm sorry I couldn't pick up your call, Paul, but if you can call the show, 310-388-9709. My thoughts about moderating the potential of a collapse is I don't have a plan other than personal survival for a viable system. I'm not the guy sitting here with the answers. I would love to say we can push this thing back onto its wheels and have an equal society where men actually have legal rights and are not treated as sort of these semi-human pariahs. But beyond providing for men some resources to opt out and protect themselves as things get increasingly hairy and irrational, I can't pretend that I am the guy with the plan at all. So for me, it's a wild ride. I don't know exactly where we're going, but I know that the current system cannot continue to run as it has done.
Well, I can agree with that statement to some extent. When we look at what we're proposing here with the possibility of financial collapse, the social collapse is going to happen. The cities are going to become the virtual deserts of our time. No municipal water supplies really to speak of, food riots, extraordinarily expensive fuel, people taking other people for ransom just for $50. If you look at the collapse in Argentina and Iceland here over the last 15 years, you see those types of things. Now, Argentina managed to come back fairly strong because they had a core of strong family values, and so their community value got them back up and running within a pretty decent period of time. Iceland, on the other hand, is much like us. Everybody's sort of an island. And so when it really hits the fan, where do you think all these people are going to go? They're not going to have anywhere to go. And those people who have farmland and things like that, those are the ones who are really going to rule the roost because they're outside the desert. They're capable of supplying their own means of survival, and they can get other people onto that land to work for them. You're looking at returning more towards a agrarian lifestyle than what we have right now.
Yeah, here's my worry. I agree with everything you're saying, but here's where I get really quite concerned. in a distributed, more localized small economy, we get away from the massive city economy, we get away from central banking, central government, we do not really have the infrastructure to distribute food to the size of the Earth's population as it is right now, without the central controls that we have in place. Our power distribution network works by central control. Our banking system works by central control. Food distribution works by central control. If everybody who lives in cities suddenly leaves the cities because there's no food, or there's no power, or there's no water, you have a massive population flooding into the surrounding land around cities, and I don't see an outcome other than the warlord model of local government, where everything is extremely local and ruled more or less by brute force at a local level without interregional cooperation. And
I absolutely see that model. Yeah.
How long that will last before something more stable emerges? 10 years? 1 generation? 2 generations?
Looking at most of the numbers, I'm looking at anywhere between 25 and 30 years if something like that were to happen. Keep in mind, however, that if that does happen, we're not just talking about the United States.
No, we're looking at the whole world.
Yeah, we're looking at millions of people starving because the grain belt of the United States can literally feed half the world's population. We just produce so much food, it's unreal. And when we no longer have the ability to distribute that food worldwide, the whole world is going to suffer.
Well, yeah, you're going to have mass starvation. And then you're going to have a protracted period of massive resource depletion, probably local wars popping up all over the place without much central control. You might have nuclear wars happening on a small scale, and it doesn't look like a very fun time for anybody. I certainly don't want this outcome. I don't want anybody listening to think for even a second that my view of human rights is one that I think that this is a viable pathway to restore human rights to anybody. I see a system teetering on the edge of collapse with a non-viable economic system, a continuously failing political system, and really bad trouble coming around the horizon. And I would love to find a way to avert it. Unfortunately, I don't see it yet. Perhaps something will come up, but I don't know what it is.
Like I said, if we get a few out there, then a few to take charge can go a long way. All right, going off now.
Okay, thanks very much. So we still got quite a bit of time left on the show, but unless I get a caller, I think we've got a caller. I'm just going to talk for a second here. In my reading and blogging, I have been looking at more of a libertarian philosophy, specifically focused around nonviolence and having a nonviolent society. My view, one of the things that I say about feminism is that it is, aside from a doctrine of hatred, it is also a doctrine of violence. And a lot of people are probably going to question me on this and say, well, you need to justify that statement. I do not mean that women or feminists, even male feminists, are directly violent. When I say that feminism is a violent ideology, I am talking about violence by proxy. As soon as you're talking about a victim ideology, and this is what we were talking about on the show, of women being by identity victims, in order to redress this victimhood, you have feminism looking to the state through legislation or through enforcement to create a different outcome than this proposed victimhood. And whether the narrative is true or not, whenever you have the state stepping in to redress these narrated grievances, that is essentially the use of violence to create an outcome. When I talk about feminism being a violent ideology, that's what I'm talking about, is this violence by proxy through state enforcers. Now, we were talking earlier in the show about the psychological disconnect between what is real and being filtered through an ideology of violence. And we were asking for Dr. T to call into the show, and I believe Dr. T is in the holding room right now. I am just going to fill the air for a second here because I believe Dr. T is talking to James. I'm going to play an ad, and we will be right back in just a second.